attend. If you weren't, please watch the video as soon as possible. Okie doke. Any questions or things on your mind? No? Okay. All right, let's do a question. I have it over here. Let's see if I can do this thing right. Start poll. Okay. There it is. Okay. Okay, so your question is, the president only has enumerated powers. That's your question. True or false? Okay. All right, let's try and go through the answers. Does anyone remember where we were last time? Deanna, are you next? Yeah. I appreciate your candor. I always do. First off, what does it mean?
Actually, Jason.
Okay, under the bus. There you go. Jason, let me start off just a little simpler question, right? What does it mean to have enumerated powers? What does that phrase mean?
The Constitution listed the powers that it had.
Right. The phrase enumerated, think of like number, right? You list them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? The idea of enumerated powers is that your powers are listed. Now, is that Colby? Are you next? No, now Deanna. Okay, we'll get to you eventually. Deanna, which branch of government has enumerated powers? We've talked about this a few points before.
The legislative branch.
Yes, Congress. We know in Article 1, Section 8, Congress's powers are enumerated, that they're written down. Now, Vanessa, does the president only have enumerated powers?
No.
Okay, tell me why.
I mean, some of them are enumerated.
Ah, okay, but not all of them.
Not all of them.
Okay, yeah, the key word in this sentence is only, right? Some of them are enumerated. For example, commander-in-chief. He can appoint judges. He can issue pardons. But a lot of the president's powers are not spelled out with any specificity. So 97%, that's very good. Almost all of you got this one, very good. Many of the president's powers are kind of open-ended. I mean, just compare the first sections of Article 1 with the first section of Article 2. Article 1 begins, all legislative powers herein granted, that is, enumerated. Congress has the powers are listed. Article 2 begins a little bit differently. It says, the executive power shall be vested in a president. What is the executive power? The Constitution really doesn't say what that means. And to this day, people disagree vigorously of what those powers are. Whatever those powers are, it belongs to a single president. That much we know, right? A unitary president. We don't know what those powers are. Let me go through some highlights in Article 2. We know that the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. Okay. When can the Army and Navy be used? Is it only when Congress declares war? Or does the president have an independent power to use military force absent a declaration of war? Armies take money. They require salaries. Who pays for the salary of the military? Well, Congress has to appropriate money. But once that money is appropriated, can the president dictate how it's used and where it's spent? Article 2, Section 3. The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is a provision that has gotten a lot of attention the last couple of years, but has been quite important for nearly 2 centuries. What does it mean? Well, at a certain level, the president has to execute the laws. He's not a lawmaker. He has to execute them, carry them into execution. And he must do so faithfully, whatever that means. Now, is the president the one executing the laws by himself? Generally, no. It's his subordinates, his cabinet, his officials, right, the people he works for. So in some regards, this is a supervisory power. He has to supervise his subordinates to make sure they're executing the law. And what if the president fails to execute the law? Or perhaps executes the law in bad faith? Is that unconstitutional? Right? What if Congress passes a law that makes it difficult for him to execute the laws? For example, Congress says you can't fire your subordinates. You can't fire your people who work in your cabinet. You can't fire prosecutors who perhaps are investigating the executive branch, right? Do those constraints impede the president's ability to faithfully execute the law? These are not easy questions. Now, you'll notice in our syllabus, we had, like 8 classes on the enumerated powers for Congress, right? And we have, like 2 classes on executive power? That's not because I'm lazy, right? That's not because I'm giving you an easy go. The Supreme Court has had very few cases about executive power. There's just very few cases to study. We have them all in your book. It's a single chapter, maybe 50, 60 pages. That's it. That's all you're going to get. Now, why is it that the Supreme Court doesn't have many cases involving executive powers? Historically, whenever you had some sort of conflict in the war-making sphere or in foreign policy or internal separation of powers, the court said, we don't want to touch it, right? We don't want to touch it. This is for the political branches to resolve for themselves. This isn't like when Congress regulates private conduct, such as selling oil, right? Here you have a dispute between the branches, right, between the executive and the legislature. In such cases, the courts generally say, we're not going to do it. Even think of Marbury, right? The very first case we had, the very first week of class. In Marbury, Chief Justice Marshall said, well, Jefferson probably broke the law, but we don't have jurisdiction to review it, right? It's not for us to decide. Because he didn't want to have that sort of conflict. This is very much the case with executive power. The court doesn't like to ever have to actually decide what this means, except when the president's executive power impacts people. So in the first case today, we have Merryman, where guys locked up. And the courts were called upon to decide whether his detention was lawful. And in the second case, we have Youngstown, where the executive seized a steel mill, private property. And the court was called upon to decide, can the president seize this mill? In our case for, in our class we have for Thursday, we have much more significant cases, right, involving Japanese detention, where an entire class of people were excluded from their homes, subjected to curfews, and put into camps based solely on their national heritage. They were Japanese. In that case, the courts were called upon to decide if the president had the authority to to detain these individuals. Okay? As we go through this topic, you have to keep 2 things in mind, right? The president has 2 sources of authority. And what are these sources of authority? One is the Constitution itself. The Constitution gives the president certain powers. He doesn't need permission for those. He can do it by himself. The second source of authority is statutes, right? Congress can enact laws that give the president powers. You always have to consider both. Has Congress has Congress given the president the power to do X? And if not, does the Constitution give the president the power to do X? Most people only want to talk about the Constitution, but that's not like the meaty part. So whenever you hear in the news, oh, does the president have the power to do something? Well, this is not some sort of organic question. Does the Constitution do it? Congress gives the president lots of powers. Sometimes you don't like the president executing them, but the powers still exist. And the question is the president's action within the scope of that delegation? It's great to give the president powers when you like the current president, but you don't like the guy, then it gets a little bit more dicey. Okay. Any questions on that introduction? Just keep those two things in mind. Does the president have power from a statute, or does the president have the power from the Constitution? Just as Jackson gets at this a little bit, we'll get to it later, but that's the general basic frame. No? Okay, very good. I think you almost all got the poll question correct. Very good. 97%. That's excellent. Okay, and class, very good. Okay, let's start our discussion today by going, as you often do, to first principles and going back to the Federalist and our good friend Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the bulk of the Federalist, including Federalist number 70. Sorry, Caitlin. Caitlin, why does Hamilton think it important to have a single executive rather than having multiple executives?
I mean, he lists several things, but one of them was, it's easier to hold them accountable.
Okay, good. Let's talk about accountability, right? Why is accountability important for an executive, the leader of our country?
I mean, it's one person messes up, it's easier to blame them versus like several people.
Yeah. This is a basic principle of human life, right? When something goes wrong, no one wants to take responsibility. It happens. I don't care if it's in a law school or in a company or wherever you are. When something goes wrong, people say, it wasn't me, wasn't me. But when there's a single leader, right, when there's one person in charge, he's responsible. You've heard the expression, the buck stops here. This was a plaque that President Truman had on his desk in the White House, in the Oval Office. So the buck stops here. When something went wrong, you knew the president was responsible for the blame. Now, the good part is when the president does something good, he takes the credit. And when he does something bad, at least in theory, he's supposed to take responsibility. So having a single executive promotes accountability. With Congress, it's his fault, that's Senator's fault. No, president, there's one. Katie, what's another rationale Hamilton gives for why a single executive is optimal?
I think he also talks about energy.
Energy, yeah, tell me about that.
How we need a fast-acting person in times of, I guess, crisis to make quick decisions.
Yeah, very good.
Tied down by.
Yeah, Hamilton uses words like energetic, vigorous, right? Hamilton recognizes that bad things happen, right? And when something bad happens, you sometimes need to take quick action, decisive action, strong action. You can't just sit around and deliberate and have a debate about what to do, right? When you have a big body, Congress takes forever to deliberate and to come to a conclusion, whereas an executive can move swiftly, right? Keep in mind this concept of the energetic, vigorous executive as we go through this topic, right? There's a civil war going on, and you have these people who are spies for the South, and the president says we need to lock them up, and we can't give them a trial. It's too risky. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's such a good idea. Of course we have to lock up these spies. The other side says, wait, how do we know they're spies? Maybe the executive's wrong, right? Maybe they're making a mistake. Or think of the steel mill. We have this national labor shortage, right? We have a strike. And if we don't keep the steel mills pouring, we won't have enough steel to make planes and munitions for the war effort. So you might say, wait a minute, yeah, we have to keep the war going, versus, wait a minute, you guys are taking private property? What kind of country is this? So the energetic executive does stuff quick. It also might do stuff you don't like very much. Right? Now, Jamie, let me ask you this question. Hamilton's writing barely a decade after the Revolutionary War, right? We had just fought off this king who was all-powerful. How do we reconcile this Hamilton's preference for a strong executive with our war against this strong king, this monarch? How do we reconcile those two concepts? How do we make those? How do we line those up? We just fought a war against a strong monarch, and here's Hamilton saying, "No, we need this strong executive." I'll try again. We had just fought a war against a very strong monarch, an energetic executive. Hamilton now says, "Well, we need a strong executive in our country too." How do we reconcile those statements?
Is that dealing with giving an executive power to one person?
Well, Hamilton wants to give all this power. In fact, Hamilton, during the convention, said he wanted a president for life. It would have been probably him. That's what he had in mind. I'm not joking. That's how he thought. There's actually a line in the Constitution that says you have to be a natural-born citizen or a citizen at the time the Constitution was ratified. Hamilton was not born in the United States. He would have been a citizen, though, at ratification. But, Jimmy, back to you. Why do you think Hamilton, putting aside his preference for a king, was still willing to have a strong executive even after fighting this revolution?
So that there would still be order?
Well, what had just come before the Constitution? What led to our Constitutional Convention? What was that a prior government called? First day of class. What was the first government we had before the Constitution? First day of class.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking.
Nancy? What was that called? I told you need to remember it. The very first day of class, we say 3 documents. What were they?
The Articles of Confederation.
Okay, very good. That's what I'm looking for. The other was a declaration. And under the Articles of Confederation, was there an executive power? Was there a strong executive in the federal government?
Yes.
Ben? No. And was that a problem? Why was that a problem?
Well, I mean, the Articles of Confederation obviously didn't work out.
That's a good point. That's true. Under our prior government, we had this Articles of Confederation, right? This first form of government, which had no central government that was of any strength, and had no executive. And what ended up happening was that we were unable to deal with foreign affairs, right? We didn't have a single person who was responsible for handling international relations, who was responsible for handling war efforts, right? Hamilton recognized this deficiency, and so in Federalist number 70, he articulates rationales about why we need this king, why we need a president, even though the king thing didn't quite work out with England, right? He says a feeble executive is a bad executive. Okay, it's a bad government. You need energy, right? Energetic executive. You need duration. That's to be in office for some period of time. You need to have support, right? Money. And he needs to have powers that are competent. He needs to be able to do what's necessary for the country. And this all folds into the idea of having a single strong executive. And if that executive misbehaves, he can be impeached. He can be removed from office. And even if he can't be removed from office, his term is only 4 years. And every 4 years he has to answer to the people whether to keep his tenure. Yes?
Also, isn't it fair to say that, as you and Professor Conrad mentioned earlier in the chapter, that Hamilton and the other constitutionalists were thinking of President Washington, or General Washington at the time?
Yes.
So is it fair to say that the Federalist 70 was written with General
Yes.
Washington in mind?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Thank you. When the Constitution was being ratified, everyone assumed that George Washington was the guy, right? He was the leader of the Continental Army. He was like the most respected person in the country, and his reputation was for one of integrity, right? He had been the leader of the military during the Revolutionary War, and historically, the general after the war is over becomes the king, right? That's how things go in history. But Washington did not do that. After the war was over, he decided to resign and go back to his farm, which was considered like an act that just doesn't happen very often. There was a famous Roman emperor named Cincinnatus. You know the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, it's named after him. And Cincinnatus was this Roman general who fought in the war, and then after the war was over, he went back to his farm. He so to speak, beat his sword into a plowshare and his spears into pruning hooks, from the line from the Bible. That's sort of what you're referring to. And he relinquished his authority. And that was George Washington's icon. In fact, Washington was part of a group called the Society of Cincinnatus. That was one of his preferences in life. So Washington was unique, but George Washington would not live forever. And whoever they had in mind would eventually be someone not George Washington. So you give a power to a man like Washington, then you have someone who's not Washington exercise, you're not so happy with it. But that's what happens when you put things in paper and they last more than 10 years. Good question. Okay. All right. Any other questions on Hamilton, Federalist number 70? Again, it's not like a judicial decision, but it helps explain how at least one of the founders viewed the role of the executive. This was by far not the only opinion. People thought Hamilton was a monarchist, he was an absolutist, he thought the executive was too strong, but this is a good window we have into at least some contemporary thinking in the 1780s. Yeah?
That's a question, but I don't.
Please.
Why did Hamilton believe that one person should be in control, but yet we have three branches of government?
Well, when you say in control of what, right?
Because he often think that disputes would get in the way of getting things done.
Yes.
However, the three governments are sent to check each other. So
Yeah.
that there is not one having more power than the other.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think Hamilton was he was a monarchist, right? I don't think he had much consideration for the courts. We don't really know what Hamilton thought about the courts, but he probably didn't think the courts would have the same sort of role they have today, probably a much smaller role. And Hamilton also thought that the government, the Congress, would be much more in line with the executive, that they would both favor expansion of federal power. So he didn't see necessarily the Congress checking the president the way we might think of it today. Madison was more about the checking and the balancing. So even in the early years, the framers had very different visions of how government ought to work, which is one way it's tough to sort of reconcile all these different competing views into a single government. But good question. To answer your question a little bit?
A little bit, but I think I get there later.
Yeah, it's not going to satisfy you. I'm sorry. If I give you a lousy answer, it's not because I'm a lousy teacher, just there aren't always good answers. People ask, do you like teaching ConLaw or property better? And I always say, actually, it's property. There are answers. Like if someone asks me a question in property, I can give you an answer that's right 100% of the time. I cannot do that in ConLaw. I can give you a range of answers and ways to think about it. I can't give you what the right answer is. That's not something this class offers, which, still fun. Still fun. Okay. Anything else on Hamilton and Federalist number 70? All right, let's go on to the first case. Exparte Merryman. This is a very strange case. Why is this a strange case? Well, first off, I think this is the only case in your book that's not decided by the Supreme Court as a whole. The opinion is written by one person, Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney. Taney's most famous or infamous opinion was Dred Scott, which we'll study in about 2 weeks or so. Why was this decision even written, right? It was rendered while Taney was sitting at the circuit court in Maryland, right? That was his home state. And at the time, justices would have certain supervisory duties over disputes from their home. In this case, it was Maryland for Taney. It's not entirely clear the nature of Taney's opinion. Why was he deciding this by himself? Right? Why did it get referred to the court as a whole? I think it's probably best understood as an opinion where he was sort of supervising a dispute in his home state where he rode circuit. But it's sort of strange that he was doing this by himself. But there we have it. This case is also strange because of how quickly it went down. In the span of a few days, the entire thing was resolved. This case is strange in a third regard, in that the court made a ruling and nothing really happened after it. The guy stayed in jail after the decision. It's a very strange opinion, but I think it's an important discussion of the executive power fairly early on in our republic. Okay, everyone with me? All righty. Is that Jonathan? Jonathan, you want to give me the facts, please, in Exparte Merryman? By the way, ex parte? What the hell is ex parte? You'll hear this phrase in law a lot. For example, ex parte means like outside the court's procedures, right? So like, if I talk to someone outside of court, it's called ex parte. But in this context, it refers to a prisoner case, right? Where there's a prisoner who is seeking some sort of relief from the court, but he's not there. So it's like he's not in the court. That's what ex parte means, generally. Jonathan, you want to tell me, just give me the facts in Merryman and what on earth is going on here? It's a very, very strange case.
So Merryman was a citizen of Maryland. He was arrested.
By the way, Maryland, you may think of, oh yeah, Maryland's like a northern state. It was a border state. Maryland remained in the Union during the Civil War, but it was a pro-slavery state. People don't quite recognize that. There were border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, that stayed in the Union but maintained slavery. And Lincoln was okay with this because he didn't want these border states to fall. Just geographically, think of Maryland. It basically borders the nation's capital on three sides. And if Maryland fell, the nation's capital would have fallen also. Right? They could not have maintained a defense of D.C., the District of Columbia, if you had Maryland as a Confederate state. So a lot of people, though, who were living in Maryland were not fans of the Union. They were, if not sympathizers, they were supporters of the Confederacy. And Merryman allegedly was one of these. Oh, all right, go on, Jonathan.
So he was a citizen of Maryland. He was arrested for treason.
Yeah, for supporting the South.
And then they kept him at one of the military bases, I believe.
Yeah, in Fort McHenry. If you ever go to Baltimore, Fort McHenry's there. By the way, the Star Spangled Banner, right? The song's actually at the War of 1812, right? And that line, the bombs bursting in air, is actually about bombs blowing up over Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And fun fact was that Francis Scott Key was like, I think, the brother-in-law to Roger Taney, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Anyway, go on. I keep interrupting you, I'm sorry. A lot of fun facts in this one, go on.
And then Taney.
Well, one step. So he was arrested, right? Was he given any sort of process before he was arrested?
No.
Did he ever talk to a judge?
They just took him in and detained him.
Okay, very good. And then what did Merryman do?
He wanted to be seen before the court, so that way he could get a ruling. So Taney issued a writ of Habeas Corpus.
Okay, well, just one step at a time, right? Just you're right on it. I want to walk through the facts very carefully. Okay, so you have a guy, Merryman. He's arrested on the order of the Union General George Cadwalader. And by the way, Cadwalader was basically the general of the Union Army. This was a very high-ranking guy. This was not like this was a very important official in the U.S. government. Merryman's attorneys go to Taney's house, if you can imagine, and they give him what's called a writ of habeas corpus. Dylan, what does that mean, a petition for habeas corpus? You call petition or writ, you see them both ways. The difference is not important here. But what's this petition for writ of habeas corpus? Dylan, yeah, go ahead.
Produce the body before the court.
Basically, yeah. So corpus means body, like Corpus Christi, right? It means deliver the body. It does not mean the guy gets out of jail, that he goes home. All it means is you produce the body to the court, and you explain why the person is being held. Again, that doesn't mean you get to go home, but just some judge gets to review the detention to make sure it's lawful. There was a long tradition in American and English courts where people cannot be detained arbitrarily, that some judge, some independent magistrate gets to review the captivity to make sure that the person actually is detained in a proper fashion. Okay? The next day, Tawney issues a writ of habeas corpus, and he orders the commander of the fort to produce the body for the next day. Dylan, does the commander of the fort actually produce Merryman's body?
No.
Okay, so what happened? This is very strange, right? What happens next?
Yeah, it's in a long letter, like with reasons why.
Yeah,
This body.
yeah. I mean, like, it's kind of like a baller move, right? It's like, sorry, no. I sometimes those judges today would have the kind of reaction, some of their opinions, but maybe that's my world. What were some of the reasons given Dylan about why the jailer, the commandant said, yeah, we're not giving his body over?
He said he had authorization from President.
Ah, I have a higher authority, right? Who are you, right? Who are you? By the way, this is the same Roger Taney who basically wrote a decision declaring entire race, inferior, right? His decision contributed in part to the Civil War. He was not very popular. He was not held in very high regard by this point in his career. So the Union is saying, look, we are fighting a war to, try to abolish the sort of thing that you said was given by the Constitution, slavery. All right, Mitchell. So let's talk about habeas corpus, right? Who suspended habeas corpus in this case?
President.
Okay, so let's look at the Constitution, right? The Constitution says, Article 1, Section 9, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion. Now, Mitchell, you said you said the president suspended habeas corpus, right? And by suspending habeas corpus, what does that mean? What does that allow the president to do?
It would then interpret Article Section 9 that he can suspend whatever he wants.
Right, but you're right. But just what does it mean to suspend habeas corpus? What does that actually mean?
They would hold the Merryman in jail without the going to court.
Very good. At a general level, what this provision means is that a person can be detained, held by the government, without giving any sort of justification to a court. That the courts cannot review or cannot accept evidence of a person's captivity. Eventually, if the government wants to let them go, they can do it. Okay. So now, Amy, let's start this question. What happens after Tawney gets this letter where the guy basically says, yeah, not bringing the body? What happens next?
He didn't really get an order. He just
Well, no. He just what did Tawney do after the general said, sorry, not going to bring the body? What did Tawney try to do?
he tried to hold the general in contempt.
What does that mean to hold the general in contempt? You're right, but what does that mean?
That he didn't comply with the court order.
Right, and when generally speaking, right, and no pun intended generally, but as a general matter, when the court holds you in contempt, what happens next, right? You're going to be a lawyer in a couple of years. Judge says, Amy, bring some document to court. You say, screw it, Judge, I'm not going to do it. Judge holds you in contempt. Don't do that, by the way. Judge holds you in contempt. What's probably going to happen to Amy? What's going to happen to you?
Punishment, like they can arrest you.
They're going to hold you in jail, right? And the contempt power is actually very strong. You can be held in jail indefinitely, right? I know that sounds insane, but courts can hold you in jail for a very long time until you comply with their order. It's a bizarre aspect of where does the contempt power come from? It's not really written down, but courts exercise it. So, Amy, just finish it up. how does Tawney seek to enforce this contempt order? What does he try to do? It's just a very, very strange thing.
Is this when he sends the opinion to the president?
No, not yet, not yet.
Oh.
But after, you're almost there, but after the general declines and Tawney holds a general contempt, what does
Hang on.
what does Tawney try to do to enforce this contempt citation? It's a bizarre scene. It's like one of these things like you can't believe actually happened.
He sent the marshal to go.
He sent the marshal where? Where did he send the marshal? Where was the general at the time? Fort McHenry. Very good. So imagine this, right? You're Roger Tawney, right? You're this really unpopular judge who issued this awful opinion called Dred Scott, right? Lincoln wins the election a couple years later. Lincoln basically ignores you in all regards. Lincoln says you're wrong with the Constitution. Lincoln then suspends habeas corpus. Tawney tells the general, you are in violation of the law, bring the body. General says, no, not going to do it because President Lincoln said I don't have to. Then Tawney sends the marshal of court. This is a single guy, right? This is a random dude in Baltimore whose job is basically to open up court, to go arrest the general of the Union Army and bring him back to the court. This is a guy in a heavily fortified military structure. We're talking like, this was a fort that was being bombarded, right, during the War of 1812. This is a strong facility. And Tawney says, oh, you can put together a posse, right, a group of people to come and seize the general. Now, you probably understand this didn't work, right? Can you just imagine this poor guy knocking on this, like, hello, I'm here to arrest the general of the Union Army. Knock, knock, who's there? It didn't work, right? And I mean, Tawney just even issue this order is just stunning, right? One of my good friends, Seth Barrett Tillman, wrote about this case, and we mentioned his article. But like, Tawney just to do this was, he had to have known this order would not be, his order to bring the general would not be complied with, right? And we talk about the first day of class. Why do people listen to courts? You say, well, if we don't listen to courts, people start ignoring them otherwise. Well, here, the general said, I'm not going to come. Right. By the way, again, the order was to the general, not to Lincoln. So Lincoln wasn't involved. It's not clear Lincoln even knew about this at the time. He maybe found out later, but I don't think Lincoln knew at this time. All right, Kyle, so now we have a situation where the general doesn't come to court, and then Tawney's like, well, screw it, I got to do something. So what does Tawney actually do? Say it again? He tells on him to the president. Oh, I like that. Okay, I've never had it explained that way. Tell me what you mean. I think it's a very, very funny way of saying it. I like that.
This guy's not doing what he's ordered to do it, so you have the power to make him, and it's your constitutional duty to do so.
Do you think that Lincoln considered Tawney his brother? No. Do you think Lincoln cared what Tawney said? No. So let me. I like the way you phrase it. It's actually kind of funny. But let me just unpack this a bit, right? Tawney writes an opinion, which I had you all read. It's not very long. And the opinion didn't direct the general to release the body, right? It didn't direct the general to release Merryman. The opinion didn't direct Lincoln to do anything, right? The case was about Merryman and the general. Instead, it simply said, hey, Lincoln, I'm going to send you this opinion. You have a constitutional oath. Do what you got to do, man, right? That's all I'm going to say. And it's a very weird opinion, right? It's often said, and all these law professors get it wrong, that Lincoln ignored Tawney. Well, that's not exactly right. Lincoln was never ordered to do anything, right? Lincoln wasn't ordered. Tawney was merely saying, here's my opinion. It's yours, right? This is one reason why the courts don't usually get involved in separation of powers cases with the executive, because the executive may not go along with it. Again, think back to Jefferson with Marbury. John Marshall understood what Tawney didn't, right? John Marshall understood that William Marbury would never be a judge. He was never getting his commission. Wasn't going to do it. Tawney thought, aha, let me give Lincoln this opinion, and the virtue of my gloriousness will just compel him to act. It didn't work. Okay, so I'm going to get to politics, right? But Braden, I want to talk about the law for a minute, right? Why does Tawney think that Lincoln's suspension was unlawful?
He thinks it was unlawful because in order to suspend writ of habeas corpus at Article 1, Section 9, which is in case of a rebellion or invasion, but Article 1, Section 9's powers to Congress.
So Tawney says that Congress has the power to suspend habeas corpus, right? How does he know that?
How does he know that?
Yeah.
Is it enumerated power?
Well, it says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless case of rebellion, right? Or invasion. But how do we know that it's only Congress that can do it?
Well, I guess Lincoln was arguing that we are in a rebellion, and for public safety, I'm going to suspend writ of habeas corpus.
No, you're right, but does the Article 1, Section 9 say that only Congress can do it?
No, it doesn't expressly say.
What? Maybe it's a shared power. Maybe both can do it. Maybe the energetic executive, the vigorous executive, can respond to this urgent executive emergency. Why? Just is Tawney right?
I mean, it is concurrent in a way. I mean, as commander-in-chief, vigorous government.
Okay. So this is one of these questions where the Constitution doesn't have a 100% answer, right? Tawney says, look, this is a power listed in Article 1. All the powers in Article 1 belong to Congress. Therefore, this is a power that Congress has alone. Lincoln says, no, not necessarily. Lincoln says the Constitution's silent. It doesn't say who can suspend it. And Lincoln says because it's silent, that means maybe the executive gets some deference in time of war. Now, I think Tawney has a better argument as a general matter. I think Tawney's probably right about this. But Lincoln's argument was not insane. And you can see a court saying, you know what, we're in this conflict now. It's not for me to decide. We'll defer to the executive branch here. As it turns out, Congress did suspend the writ afterwards. And they made it retroactive. They said, we suspend the writ going back to the day of Lincoln's initial order. So Congress eventually got into the game. But at the time this happened, Congress was in recess, and they couldn't be, they couldn't assemble. This wasn't like, today you have airplanes. People had to come from all across the country. They couldn't get to D.C. quickly enough. So Lincoln perhaps did something in emergency to keep the government going until Congress could come along. So maybe the president does have this power. We don't know. Tawney's opinion, although it's sort of ridiculed, I think sets the correct constitutional standard. That's only for the congressional branch to do it. But it's not self-evidently true that he's right. It doesn't have to be true. Maybe when Congress is in recess, the president might have some sort of temporary power to suspend habeas corpus until Congress can get together and assemble. Okay. All right. Yes, Rush.
Is Article 1, Section 9 what's used, or that particular clause in Article 1, Section 9, for instance, what's going on in Guantanamo, for instance?
Oh, it's a good question. The question was whether Article 1, Section 9, it's called the suspension clause, whether that provision is being used for Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is a unique place. It's now been used to detain people for, oh my God, almost 20 years. I mean, 9/11 was what, 18 years ago? Is that right? I think I'm 17. Almost 2 decades. The reason why the Bush administration selected Guantanamo Bay to hold people who were captured in Afghanistan and later Iraq was because they thought it was outside the United States. And they thought that the writ of habeas corpus would not run to Guantanamo Bay. Therefore, they thought they could detain people basically indefinitely in Guantanamo without worrying about the suspension clause. And in 2008, the Supreme Court decided a case called Boumediene. And Boumediene held that Guantanamo was basically part of the United States. So the writ of habeas corpus extends there. But that was what now, almost a decade ago. The mere fact that habeas corpus applies doesn't mean the guys get out of prison. It merely means that judges can review their captivity. Indeed, we now have military judges who are in Guantanamo who do things, but it's a very drawn-out process and it takes forever, and no one's actually been brought to full trial yet. It's like this never-ending saga that just will not go anywhere. That's Guantanamo in a nutshell. It was a military base in Cuba for almost a century. It's been there forever, but the detention facility has been going on for... When I was in law school, I went to law school 2006 to 9. That was like the biggest issue, Guantanamo, right? That's all we've heard about now, just sort of just vanished. You don't really hear about it much anymore. It's still there. There are a couple hundred people there. They're still there. They're in fact getting older. One of the problems is they need to basically build senior care facilities because people in their 50s and 60s. They were in their 30s and 40s. Now they're becoming senior citizens. They spent their entire adult lives in these camps. Okay. Questions on Guantanamo or habeas corpus? You have cases in your book on habeas corpus. I don't assign them. We have one Guantanamo case called Hamdi, Hamdi. I don't assign it because the case is a mess. There are like 6 opinions. They're all fragmented. I don't think it's very useful. I'm going to tell Randy we should cut it the next edition. But if you want to read it, it's in your book. I'd be happy to talk about it if you want. Okay. Anything else? All right, let's look at the Emancipation Proclamation. This is also sort of a weird topic that doesn't fit in with our usual routine because it's not a case, right? It's not even a legal dispute. President Lincoln issued this order, and it was an order. No court really reviewed it, at least right away. Kimberly, what exactly did the Emancipation Proclamation accomplish?
It was an attempt to free slaves in rebellion states.
Okay, very good. It emancipated slaves in the rebel states. Kimberly, let me ask you a follow-up. What gave President Lincoln the power to issue the Emancipation Proclamation?
He relied on the Dred Scott opinion, didn't he? Where he said people are in that case were considered property, and so he said he's going to seize this property and release it as a free human.
Yeah, and one last follow-up. Why did he limit his order to the rebel territories? You basically answered already. I will just clarify the point.
I think, from what I understand, like his primary goal wasn't to actually free the slaves, but to keep the Union intact.
Yeah.
And I guess that was the best way he thought about doing it because.
Yeah. So let me talk about this for a few moments. 'Cause it's a very important instance in American history. The reasons behind the Civil War are complicated. There was not one single factor. And as the war progressed, some factors became more important than others. I think it would be a mistake to say that the Civil War was only about slavery. I think there were other issues at play. But slavery was a very important aspect of the war. And at least for many Northerners, the abolition of slavery was considered a necessary means to keep the Union together. When we studied Prigg, we talked about the Fugitive Slave Trade and the Fugitive Slave Act. Slavery was tearing the country apart. And most of the Northerners recognized that the Union could not survive half slave, half non. Lincoln famously said, "A house divided cannot stand." And I think Lincoln was right. During the Civil War, Lincoln issued this proclamation. And the goal of the proclamation was to emancipate, that is, to free slaves who were in the rebel territory. It did not apply to the border states of Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri and Delaware, right? Those states were too important. But there's a legal reason why the emancipation did not apply to the border states. Lincoln relied on his war powers as commander-in-chief, right? Lincoln said, I need to put down this rebellion. Right? The southern states were not actually seceding, right? Lincoln never recognized this new country, this Confederate States of America. Lincoln said these are just rebels. That's why, in fact, they're called rebel territories. They're like rebellion, right? And Lincoln said, I am going to use my war powers in the rebel territory. I can't do it in the Union territory because there's no rebellion. And in fact, there were some parishes in Louisiana that was totally random that were supporting the North. The emancipation did not apply in those parishes. I never actually looked into the history of this, but there were apparently some pro-union places in Louisiana. All right, but Lincoln's argument, though, is sort of strange, right? It's one of these weird arguments like, wow, I really like the result, but man, that reasoning, right? And so what was the argument? He said, well, we have Dred Scott, and Dred Scott said that slaves are property. Okay. Under long-standing practice, if the executive was fighting a war, he could seize property. You know, think of like, you know, Gone with the Wind, right? You ever saw that movie? Remember there's a scene, there's like this huge factory of like ammunition, and they're worried about them seizing it, so they basically blow the thing up, right? During war, a military commander can seize, can take property. So Lincoln says, aha, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to seize these property, these human beings, these people. And then once these people are in the possession of the United States government, I'm going to emancipate them. I'm going to free them. I'm going to free them. If I understand what's going on, right? It's a two-step, right? So first, you're basically relying on Dred Scott to seize these individuals as property. But then you say, but I'm going to liberate them as people. So in effect, all the slaves were emancipated who were in the rebel territory. The second aspect was actually perhaps even more significant in the short term, right? Don't make any mistakes. When Lincoln issues emancipation, the people in the South said, all right, guys, go free. No, that's not what happened. They were maintaining the bondage. This was for after the war, if it were to end. But more significant was a provision that said if you were a slave and you came to the North and joined the military, joined the Union Army, you got your freedom. That was a huge incentive for a lot of people to join the North, right? That actually gave them their freedom for them and their families. That aspect of the emancipation conflicted with Dred Scott, because Dred Scott said that that's not allowed. These people were not citizens at all. They're not people. All right, so Lincoln has this very complicated, I think is the wrong word, but there's this very legalistic approach to the war, right? He said, well, there's no war, it's a succession. No, there's no succession, it's rebellion, right? Slaves are property, but we're going to make them citizens, right? So there's a sort of these very tough arguments that were made going back and forth about this time period. Now, I had an exam question about a year ago that got some press that was based on this issue. The question was premised on Lincoln, right? The setup was this. He had survived his assassination, and then he was later impeached for acting unconstitutionally. And the question was whether the Emancipation Proclamation was lawful. And we have here the objection from Justice Curtis. He was former Justice Curtis. And Curtis, I think, lays down some criticisms of it. Now, just one about Benjamin Robbins Curtis. He was a Northerner. He was an abolitionist. He was a dissenter in Dred Scott. The vote in Dred Scott was not 5-4, it was 7-2. He was one of the dissenters in Dred Scott. He was so disgusted by Roger Taney, he resigned from the Supreme Court. He's like, screw this, I'm not doing this anymore. I am gone, I'm out, right? But Curtis actually brings forward some arguments that, I think are worth discussing. So folks, like, what are some of Curtis's arguments about Lincoln, which is strange because the guy's an abolitionist, right? And he's saying that you can't do this. Like, what are some of the arguments that Curtis puts forward?
We argue that a president has a right to subdue enemy at all costs, but the framers didn't envision an executive branch that disregarded the Constitution.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So basically, it's like, look, I like the result, right? I like what you're doing. This is an evil thing. We should get rid of it. But the executive can't do this by himself. And I think Curtis makes, I think he makes the argument that the president doesn't have the power to do this, right? And I think he expresses concerns that if the president has this power, it might be abused, right? Everyone loves executive power when their guy's in office, right? When their preferred president's in office. And then when someone else is in office, oh my God, we can't have executive power. Every 4 to 8 years, the thing just cycles through. I've been teaching now for about 8 years. Everything just cycles through. Nothing's ever new. But whenever you have an executive in charge, it works great if you like what he's doing, and otherwise, not so much. Okay. One note on the Emancipation Proclamation issue. You haven't studied Dred Scott yet, but you will study it later. One of the arguments Tawney raises is that if, in fact, slaves are freed and slaves are property, the government has to pay for it. Right? The Constitution says if private property is taken for public use, you have to give just compensation. There was a very strong fear after the Civil War that slave owners would come back to court and say, we want compensation for the emancipation. The 14th Amendment actually addresses that issue. So Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which no one ever reads, but it's there. It says, the United States shall not pay any debt incurred for the loss of emancipation of any slave. Basically, any debt that was accrued to the United States by emancipating from Lincoln, the United States will not pay. That's like a remarkable thing to put in there. Again, no one ever reads that far in the 14th Amendment. It's right there in print. They were worried that the courts would come back and say that Lincoln acted unlawfully, along the lines that Justice Benjamin Robbins Curtis wrote about. So this was not an easy thing to do, and this was not uncontroversial. It's very controversial. Is that a hand in the back? Okay, so that's in there. Okay. But again, why exactly does Lincoln have this power? His war-making powers. Does it say the president can do this? No, but he's the commander-in-chief, and maybe the commander-in-chief has his power, maybe he doesn't. But at least here, the courts did not want to get involved with whether Lincoln's seizure was lawful. Okay. Okay. Any other questions on the Emancipation Proclamation? All right, let's move on. The next case is probably one of the most important separation of powers cases of all time. It's a very significant case, and I hope you can all think about it very carefully. Youngstown Sheet and Two Company versus Sawyer. Angela, you want to give me the facts, please? No? You shake your head no? I'm not really asking you, but sure. I was saying, would you? One second. Just Justice Stevens, who again I think passed away about a month ago, he would always, at argument, he was very polite. He says, "May I ask you a question?" He wasn't actually asking you, "Can I ask you a question?" But he was just very polite. "May I ask you a question?" Right? It was meant to disarm you. The answer is always, "Of course." Right? One student, "Can I ask you a question?" "No." All right, Angela, go ahead. I think you can give the facts, please, in Youngstown, please.
Owners and their employees were having a dispute.
Good, yeah.
And the employees said if they don't resolve those disputes, that they would go on strike.
Good, okay.
And the president was concerned because they made guns and things like that for war, and I think that they were like in some type of war or something. And so he seized the steel mills, and so they could stay in operation.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Angela. It's very good. This was a time when the Korean War was going on. Now, a lot of law students don't know what the Korean War is. They've never heard of it. You may have heard of Vietnam, but what's Korea? So during the early 1950s, the United States was involved in a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. You've probably heard of North Korea and South Korea. Why are there two different Koreas? The country was basically split in half. right? The northern part of the country was aligned with the Soviets, right? The southern part of the country was aligned with the West. The exact nature of the conflict is far beyond the scope of this class, but it was a complicated war. The United States never declared war in Korea. We never declared war. Instead, the war was fought based on a resolution from the United Nations. United Nations. What is the United Nations? They're actually now in assembly today in D.C. If you ever go to New York during the UN General Assembly, it's a freaking disaster. It's gridlocked everywhere. It's awful. But thankfully, I'm very far away right now. The United Nations is an international organization of countries. They make arrangements, they make agreements, they do stuff, they hold hearings, I don't know. The United States entered the United Nations by virtue of a treaty, which was ratified by the Senate. President Truman, who was in office, decided that we could use military force against Korea based on the UN's work. A lot of people were skeptical about that, and in fact, in his opinion, you can see some, skepticism about whether this was even a legal war. The court doesn't go all the way, but they're skeptical. Okay. The facts in this case are dramatic. Very dramatic. The union, the steelworkers, they give notice that they're going to begin a nationwide strike. This wasn't just a strike at the facility in Youngstown, Ohio. This was a strike nationwide. President Truman determined that this strike would harm the war effort in Korea. Why? We would not have enough steel to make planes and bombs and tanks and other things that are made during a war. And steel is sort of unique in that you have to have a lot of lead time. You can't just make steel in 5 seconds. You have to heat it up. There's a lot of work that's involved. On the eve of the strike, a few hours before the strike begins, President Truman issues Executive Order 10340. Desiree, let me ask you a question. What is an executive order? What does that mean?
It's basically an order of the president authorizing law or something to pass through immediately.
Okay, so an executive order is a statement from the president, okay, saying do something, right? Who's he telling to do something here?
In this case, he told Charles Sawyer.
Okay, who's Charles Sawyer?
Secretary of Commerce.
Okay, very good, thank you. Right, an executive order is nothing special, right? It's merely the president saying to his Secretary of Commerce, do something. And generally when the president tells his subordinates to do something, they do it, right? They don't say no. I mean, if they say no, they're going to resign. That's, but they generally do whatever he asks. Okay? And Caroline, what did the president ask Sawyer to do here? Okay, now let's be precise here, Caroline. What does it mean for the U.S. government to seize the steel mills? What does it actually mean? Like to grab them? I mean, what does it mean to seize the mills? Okay, yeah, you're right, but what does it mean for the government to take ownership of the mills? Does that mean that, there'll be a government official working the plant and government officials in the management office? Is that what it means? No, what does it mean?
It means that they operate and manage.
Well, who's still doing the day-to-day steel work?
The employer.
Yeah, and the steel workers, right? But I thought they were going on strike. Weren't they about to go on strike? Why can't they go on strike with the mill being seized?
Because they can be punished.
Oh, yeah. Caroline, finish it up. What would have happened if the steelworkers walked out the door with the U.S. government in charge?
They would have been thrown in jail.
I think they'd be arrested. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing that, when you're at a job and you walk off the job and your manager says, hey, come back. It's like, screw you, I'm going on strike. Right? It's nothing when there are people with guns at the door saying, you're going to stay here and you keep working. I'm only slightly exaggerating, right? But the idea is, The idea is when the government appropriates property, think of like, in Venezuela, some other country, right? You can't say no. You can't say, no, this is my business. I'm not handing it over. You can't say, I'm going home today. You're going to keep working there. If not, they'll probably arrest you, put you under captivity. You would like poor Mr. Merryman held at the fort in Baltimore, right? Only slightly exaggerating. So the government seized the mills. And the word seized, I don't like it very much, but it basically means they took complete ownership. Everyone, the managers stayed in place, the workers stayed in place. They had to keep making steel, but they were required to do it under government supervision. Okay? So they were not messing around here, my friends. This is not a joke. This is a very serious business. All right. Is that Brandon? Okay, Brandon, what happened after Secretary Sawyer took ownership of the mills? Oh, by the way, the case is called the steel seizure case because they seized the steel mills. That's what it's called also. All right, Brandon, what happened after the mills were seized? Yeah, immediately. Yeah, I mean, this is they knew this was coming. This wasn't a surprise. Like, this had been, discussed. So they ran to court. And they sought what's called injunctive relief, like an injunction. They wanted to block the steel seizure. Okay, and Brandon, what happened?
2 weeks later, on April 29th, the district court called the executive order.
Yeah.
After the court was able to put the case on.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Brandon. This was a pretty big deal. We're a federal district court judge in D.C., Judge Pine, who you probably never heard of, but he was a judge, and he said, no, Mr. President, you can't do this. At that point, the Court of Appeals said, whoa, this is above our pay grade, right? This is not for us. This is for the Supreme Court. We're not going to mess around here. So we're going to say, lower court, we're putting your ruling on hold. You guys appeal to the Supreme Court tomorrow, like the next day. And they appealed immediately to the Supreme Court. And of course, yeah, we'll hear it basically a week later, right? So this was, rocket, right? Usually cases take a couple years to get to the Supreme Court. We're talking here less than a month from start to finish, 2 months maybe. All right, now, Ray, let me ask you a question. All this stuff's going on in court, right? Describe for me, please, a relationship between Congress and the President at this time. What's going on between the branches? Forget the courts for a minute. Yeah. President Truman says, I'm taking the mills. What happens next with Congress?
I think President Truman sends some kind of messages
Yeah.
to Congress, just letting them know, hey, heads up, I'm doing this.
Yeah. Did he ask for permission, Ray?
No, it wasn't.
It's one of those ask for forgiveness, not permission type deals, right? You know that rule? It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. He doesn't even ask for forgiveness. It's like, I'm doing this. You can do something if you want, but I'm doing this, right? It's not like, do I have your permission, or what do you think, guys, or hey, I want these mills. You want to back me up here? It's like, I did it. Here's some notice. If you want, we could talk about it, but I did it, right? And then, Ray, what does Congress do in response to these sort of messages?
They didn't do anything.
They do nothing. And what do we make of that, Ray? The fact that the president took this really significant action, and Congress said, yeah, whatever, no big deal.
Well, it leaves us in the dark. We don't get an approval. We don't get a denial. We don't get feedback.
What do we make of silence? Think of contracts, right? Is silence acceptance, right? What do we make of just this? They don't do anything one way or the other.
That sounds more like an approval.
Yeah, I think it does. I don't know about you. The fact that Congress could have done something and didn't suggest that they thought it was okay. Maybe, I don't know. We don't know. Maybe Congress was afraid. Maybe they were doing other things. Maybe they were busy. But they were we didn't object. Congress didn't say, what? Whoa, Truman, get back down there. Go. We're going to issue a statute overriding your order, right? They didn't. They were okay. And this is an important point, right? What happens when the president does something illegal, and Congress oh, that's cool. Think of Lincoln with the Habeas Corpus. Lincoln suspended the writ. I don't think he had that power, but Congress yeah, that's cool. We'll just reaffirm you. But they didn't say no, Lincoln, you broke the law, right? What happens when the executive does something and the Congress okay, that's cool?
It becomes a pattern.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing about when one Congress surrenders a power and they set a practice, then subsequent Congresses are sort of bound by that. And future presidents can say, look, Lincoln did it and Truman did it. Why can't whoever do it? Current president, right? Yeah. A very good point, Ray. Sergio? Yeah, Sergio. So walk me through. Let's start with Justice Black, right? There were, like 5 or 6 separate opinions, right? One of the downsides of resolving a case like in a month is they don't have time to discuss things, right? So rather than having like a consensus where they'll kind of agree on one opinion, they'll wrote their own damn thing, right? They'll wrote their own thing. They could not even agree on a single. I mean, Black has the majority, so Justice Black wrote the majority. That much is clear. But the opinions take very different, I think, directions. So, yeah, Sergio, you want to walk me through the opinion, the majority opinion from Justice Hugo Black?
Okay, so Justice Black made a textual argument. He talked about several clauses in the Constitution and basically said that the president lacked the constitutional authority and that it was a violation of separation of powers.
Uh-huh.
He used the vesting clause as well as the commander-in-chief clause and the take care clause.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's walk through this one at a time, right? I think I have a few of the clauses up here. So, Sergio, what was the first clause you mentioned again?
Article 2, Section 1.
Okay, what does that say?
Executive power shall be vested in the president.
Okay, very good. Okay, this provision is called the vesting clause of Article 2. Why is it called the vesting clause? Because it says the executive power shall be vested. What does vested mean? Think like installed or given or transplanted, right? It says whatever the executive power is, it's put in one president. Okay. Sergio, does the vesting clause give the president the power to seize private property? Well, how do we know what the executive power is? Maybe it is the power to seize private property. You see the problem here, right? It says the executive power is vested in the president, but the Constitution does not define what the executive power is. Truman comes to court and says, hey, you guys, I got power, right? I got the power. Right? I got the power. It's the executive power to seize property. Now, is that Richie? Richie, what might one way be for us to determine if the president has power? You know, we're in a class, you're a law student, but maybe you'll be a judge one day, right? And you're called upon to ask, what powers does the president have? What might we look to decide what powers the president has?
The Constitution or the Congress has
Congress, right? How's Congress behaving? That's Jackson, right? Jackson, we'll get to in a minute, talks about the relationship between Congress and the president. Richie, what else might we look to decide what the executive power is? Well, the Constitution right there, that's all it says. I don't know, 10 words up there. That's all you got. What else might you want to look to? What might be relevant to decide President Truman can do this? What might we want to look to? Yeah, prior practice, right? This is something we'll get to in a bit, but to understand the executive power, it might be relevant to see what have past presidents done. Now, if President X did something, and then President Y did something, and President Z did something, that might be good evidence that the executive power includes that power. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe they're all wrong. Maybe they acted all illegally and just no one stopped them. We'll try it. Matt, let's go into the next clause, right? It says the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. Does Justice Black think this clause is relevant to this case? Why?
What? Because he said it was too attenuated. No, yeah, I remember.
well, why is the commander-in-chief power attenuated or maybe not connected with this sort of issue?
Because this was an order of the Secretary of Commerce to seize private property.
Where?
In the United States, belonging to, you know.
And where was the war being fought?
Well, in Korea, of course.
Okay. So we have a situation here. We have this military conflict in Korea, which may or may not be authorized. And you have the steel plant in Ohio somewhere. And the court basically says that the idea of the commander-in-chief fighting a war abroad, that power doesn't transplant itself to domestic, to the home soil, or to the home front. And you can't use it. Okay? So that's no good. Then we have the take care clause, right, which says basically the president shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. This is the one that actually I think makes a little bit more difference, right? The court says that the power to execute the laws is not the power to make laws, right? In other words, in order to execute the laws, Congress had to enact the law in the first place. Right? In order to execute the laws, Congress would have to enact a law in the first place. Oh, no one's in the front row. Okay, come back down to Ethan. So Ethan, let me ask this question then, right? We ask two things. Does the Constitution give the president the power to seize the mills? The court here says no. What's the second thing we look to beyond the Constitution?
Statute.
The statute, right? Do the laws of the United States, do the laws the president has to execute give the president the power? If Congress enacted a statute that says, Mr. President, in the event of a labor shortage, in the event of a strike, you can seize the steel mills. Would the president have the power to seize the mills?
No, sir.
You don't think so? Why not?
Because there was no statute.
I said if.
Oh.
The question was if there was such a statute. Let's try it again. Ethan, if there was a statute that said you can take the steel mills in the event of a strike, could he do it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, no question, right? If Congress enacts a statute telling the president, you can take the mills, we'll pay for it, no problem, I think it would be an awful statute, but he can do it. Was there such a statute in this case, though?
No, sir.
No. So therefore, does the president have the power, according to the majority, to seize the mills, the statutory authority?
No, sir.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Ethan. Black's approach is very, we might call formalistic, right? What does formalism mean? It's very rigid. It's, does the Constitution give him this power? No. Does a statute give him this power? No. Therefore, it's illegal, right? It's you check the boxes, easy. The Black opinion, even though it's the majority, doesn't get much attention. In fact, you'll read a case next week where basically, for Thursday, where the majority basically ignores the Black opinion, right? They go into Jackson. Now, one more point on the statute, right? Oh God, it's highlighted in blue. That's tough, Matt. Matt, were there other statutes in which Congress gave the president power to resolve labor disputes? Were there other laws that maybe are in this ballpark? He talks about it. Did you notice about the Taft-Hartley Act?
Sorry, I must have missed that.
Anyone have it? Yeah.
Yeah, Congress had already denied that act in 1947.
Yeah. Yeah, tell me a little bit more, Ray.
Well, I think this was during or after World War II.
Good.
I guess they were looking to also sell labor disputes there, and it was denied by Congress in respect to a governmental seizure. So it was specifically what they were trying to do now, what Sherman is trying to do now. So if Congress denied it then, they would most likely deny it now.
Yeah, I think that's good. Congress had considered whether to give the president the power to seize property, to seize businesses in the event of a strike. They considered it, and they rejected it. They declined to give the president that power. And Justice Black says, look, this is something Congress talked about. They said, no, we're not going to give it to you, President Truman. So the majority ruled against President Truman for Justice Black. Okay. Any questions on the Black opinion? Any questions on the Hugo Black opinion? No? Okay. All right, Matt, you want to then give me Justice Frankfurter's opinion, please?
Yeah, so he's the one who talked about like the tradition. Like the gloss of the Constitution.
Okay, so walk me through this concept of gloss. You used the right word, but it's a little bit of a complicated concept.
Basically, like if there was like a tradition of presidents like doing something, and it hasn't been like questioned by Congress, then it can kind of be treated as like a gloss of executive power.
Yeah.
Like if if it hadn't been questioned, it's something that kind of just let go. But however, there hadn't been a like standing practice of presidents like seizing private property. So therefore, according to Justice Frankfurter, Truman didn't have the power to seize the mills.
Very good. So Justice Frankfurter gives an opinion with a very different take. His approach is not very formalistic, right? Whereas Justice Black is based on formalism, Justice Frankfurter is much more pragmatic, and this might reflect their backgrounds. Justice Black was a Roosevelt appointee. He was a senator from Alabama. Sorry, I was thinking of Huey Long. He was a senator from Alabama, and he was much more of a textualist and formalist. He tried to be very limited in his role. Justice Frankfurter was a law professor, unfortunately, and you should keep law professors from all positions of power, in all regards. They belong nowhere near the seats of power. We're too dangerous. But Justice Frankfurter, true. Justice Frankfurter looked to history, and he said, we don't know what the Constitution actually means. How can any of us actually know? But practice, right? Executive branch practice tells us a lot. So, for example, if President Washington did something, right? And President Adams did something, and then President Jefferson did something, and President Madison did something, all the founding presidents kept doing something, right? There was a systematic, unbroken chain where all the presidents did something, and Congress never questioned it. Congress said, oh yeah, that's cool, right? That's fine. If we have this systematic, unbroken chain, then that should tell us something about the executive power. That the executive power actually has like a gloss on it. What's a gloss? Think of like lip gloss, right? When you have a surface, you put like this little thin sheet on top of it. That's how I remember it, right? They've had this systematic, unbroken executive practice, long pursued to the knowledge of Congress, and never questioned. That's the important part. It's never questioned. You basically add a layer to the Constitution. In other words, like you have the Constitution here, right? And then like you get another one on top of it, right? It's Washington's Constitution and Jefferson's Constitution and Lincoln's Constitution, right? One on top of the other. This effect, oh my God, took us so long to do.
In other words, Presidents Washington.
Yeah, I talk. But this one took me a while to figure out, but I actually got it. But the problem for Truman is that you didn't have this sort of unbroken practice, right? You didn't have all the presidents doing this. You didn't have a history of many executives seizing the steel mills. So therefore, Justice Frankfurter found that the seizure was unlawful. Okay? All right. So any questions on the Justice Frankfurter opinion? Frankfurter doesn't get a lot of Frankfurter doesn't get a lot of credit, but I think he informs the court's thinking quite a bit. You'll read a case, I think, next week called National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, versus Noel Canning, and Justice Breyer puts a lot of weight in Frankfurter. Yes, sir, Tanner.
So, if that a president, if that he breaks the law for 200 years, then it's going to be okay?
Yeah, basically. That's one of the problems with the Frankfurt approach. You haven't studied property 2 yet, but you'll study a concept called adverse possession, which is squatting, right? You know what squatting is? Where basically if you live in a guy's house for 10 years, it becomes your house. You were wrong to be there. But after a while, you get so used to it, that becomes a new law. And Justice Scalia ridicules this as the adverse possession theory of constitutional law, that if enough presidents break the law, it becomes legal, which is the position Tanner articulated a minute ago. Yeah, it's just, Frankfurter is basically, again, the law professors, do not let law professors in positions of power. You'll wind up in a very dark place. No, I'm mostly joking. Mostly. Really, we don't belong anywhere but here. Yeah, Braden.
Is it necessary in these historical gloss that it has to be unbroken? It has to be one unified.
Well, the problem with the Frankfurter approach is how broken is unbroken, right? In other words, if 20 presidents did it, if 5 presidents did it, and what if like 3 presidents did it, right? Is that unbroken? What's systematic? What does it mean for Congress to question it also? These are not easy questions. The problem is the Frankfurter one, if taken seriously, wouldn't matter, right? If there was some practice that was so well established, it's not going to court. The reason why something goes to court is because it's novel and it's never been done before. So by definition, the fact that this issue gets to the Supreme Court means that this is not systematic, unbroken practice. So it doesn't have much weight, right? But you'll do a case called Noel Canning in about 2 weeks, or about a week, which involves the president's recess appointments. And whether the president can make an appointment during a 3-day break in the Senate. Court says no. In that case, there was no history of such short breaks being made. So usually if there's no such practice, it's an easy case. It's only a hard practice if there's disputes. Make sense? Yes, sir. All right, so the question was, what stops the president's power from going up and up and up and up? And the short answer is not much. Over the long haul, the president can acquire powers in ways that are difficult to check. And it's not a Republican-Democratic issue. Every single Democratic president talks a good talk in the campaign. They do the exact same thing their predecessor did. There's not much to surprise. Why? Because when you're in power, you want to get your stuff done. And you recognize that Congress isn't going along with your agenda, you start turning to various exercises of executive power to bypass Congress in different ways. So it's not a partisan affair, it's an executive affair where each president builds upon the power of his predecessor. And generally the courts, now they do, but historically courts haven't checked that, not so much the last couple of years. Okay. All right, let's go into the next opinion. I think, Tanner, you next? Or yeah. Give me Justice Douglas's opinion. Justice Douglas, again, also a law professor, Lord help you. There were way too many law professors in the court this time. What does Justice Douglas argue?
He is going to argue that if the government is going to take somebody's personal property, they have to provide a compensation.
Okay, very good.
And so that would mean that only Congress can do it because they are the only ones who can give it, who can provide the compensation, I guess.
Okay, very good. The Constitution says that the Constitution says that when property is taken, you have to provide compensation. We talked about this a minute ago with the Emancipation. They seized private property. Truman did not pay you for it. So it's like, hey, you guys, we're going to take over your business. We're not going to pay you for it. That's no good. Douglas says the only way to take property is to pay for it. And then Tanner, what's the only branch that can compensate for property?
That would be our Congress.
Congress, right? Congress can take money out of the Treasury and spend it. The president cannot spend money by himself. Therefore, it would be impossible for the president to seize property because the president can't pay for it. It has to come from Congress. I think this is a structural argument that makes an awful lot of sense. Okay. All right. Questions on the Jackson opinion? I'm sorry. Ahead of myself on the Douglas opinion. Yeah, William O. Douglas was he was a law professor at Yale. Then became the commissioner of the SEC. Really smart guy. He served for I think almost 35 or 36 years. He towards the end he became quite old and enfeebled. He actually had a stroke on the bench. Not while he was on the bench, but while he was a justice, he had a stroke, and he became basically incapacitated. He lost his mind basically, and his colleagues would not give him any opinions to write. And any 5-4 case with him as a fifth vote, they would just reassign it to someone else. They would just re-argue the case. Eventually he resigned, but he had a long career. He considered running for president several times, although he had his personal issues. He was divorced a few times. He had a thing where he would leave his wife for his secretary and then leave his secretary. So he did a couple times. Basically, he married a couple secretaries over the years. Finally, he married a law student who was many years his junior. Just William O. Douglas. The guy was. He was something else. He was he exercises his life tenure very well. All right, we'll say more about Douglas later. But yeah, he was a bizarre guy. Okay, very smart though. Very very smart. Don't get me wrong. Okay. The next opinion is by Justice Jackson, and Justice Jackson is probably one of the 20th century's greatest justices. He served for a very brief period of time on the court, only about 10 or 11 years. He died a young man. He had a heart attack. Oh, this guy too. A couple of things about him. He apparently was, again, having an affair with someone who he worked for. He died in her apartment and a heart attack there. Dude, these people, they were such personalities. You think today's justices are interesting? The details are sketchy because back then you wouldn't disclose why he was in this woman's apartment. But he was in her apartment. He had a heart attack. I'll let you figure out the rest. Look, I mean, by the way, who was clerking for Jackson this term? It was actually William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist, the future Chief Justice. And in fact, Jackson and Rehnquist didn't get along well. Rehnquist hated Jackson, and he thought his opinion was all wrong, and he criticized it heavily. Funny story, remember I told you that Rehnquist proposed to O'Connor by letter while he was clerking for Jackson. That's when he proposed by letter, and then she said no. These people had stories, right? You know, things were, even before texting, there was funny stuff, right? But Jackson had a unique history. He served, by the way, he never graduated from law school. He attended, I think, for a year or two, but then became an attorney in New York. He didn't have to actually graduate law school to become an attorney. He passed the bar. Jackson served at all levels of the Roosevelt administration. He served as a Solicitor General, as a top lawyer for the government. He served as the Attorney General of the United States. And he witnessed firsthand how the executive used its powers during how the executive used its powers during the war. And he actually approved of some pretty aggressive uses of executive power, which he later came to regret. And in his opinion, at a couple points, he's basically criticizing stuff he did as Attorney General, which I think that takes some guts. Think of Chief Justice Chase, who said, no, never mind paper money, I was wrong. But it takes some, I think, courage to come out and say I was wrong and write this in opinion. Jackson also had a lot of experience overseas. He was appointed as the lead prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. What were the Nuremberg trials? These were war trials held after the World War II for the Nazis. The Nazis were put on trial. And Jackson served as the lead prosecutor of the Nazis at these war trials. So he was a remarkable person. He was a remarkable lawyer, remarkable judge. He died way too soon. I think it was in his 50s or so. He was a young man. But Jackson approached this by saying that, look, my experience has had a realistic influence on my views, right? The stuff I've been through, that's perhaps shaped my life. And he says that there is a poverty of really useful resources to rely on, right? The phrase executive power doesn't tell us much. He says, our forefathers could not have anticipated the sorts of conflicts we have. And we can't govern based on clauses of the Constitution. It's the opposite of Black, right? Black said we can look at the clause of the Constitution. Executive power, that's not it, right? Jackson's like, we don't know what this stuff means, right? We can't know how to approach this. So instead, Justice Jackson comes up with this framework, which I'll teach you. I don't think it's very helpful, right? Law students love it, right? Law students love this, and they apply it all the wrong ways. So before I tell you what it is, let me tell you where it doesn't apply, right? If I ask you in a question, does Congress have the power to do X? I do not want to hear about Jackson, right? This only applies to the executive, right? This only applies to the executive. If my question is, does Congress have the power to do X? Do not tell me about Justice Jackson. At least 10 of you will in the exam. I know you will. But I'm warning you, giving you very fair warning. There's no hiding the ball here. Okay. So when do you apply this framework? When the president takes some action, and it's unclear if he has the power to do that action, right? When the president does something, and it's not clear, can the president do it, right? If there's a statute that says the president can do X, you don't need to do Jackson stuff, right? It's kind of silly. It's unnecessary. The only time you'd use this is if there's some doubt of whether Congress, in fact, gave him that power. Everyone with me? Understand? All right. Jackson sketches these three zones, okay? Right? These three zones, which are not rigid, right? These are not clearly defined. But there are these three categories you can use to understand whether the president has the power. And these categories are premised on the relationship between the president's powers and Congress's powers. And at each step, you ask yourself, what is the president relying on? So the first zone, zone 1, if you will, is what you might call the maximum authority. Why is it maximum? Because the president's relying on his own executive powers in Article 2 and Congress's lawmaking powers. So you have the powers from Article 2 and the powers from Article 1 combined, right? In other words, the president has whatever his own powers are, plus whatever powers Congress gives. In this zone, the president's probably acting lawfully, right? The president's probably okay. As a result, the court applies what you might call the strongest presumption of constitutionality. The strongest presumption of constitutionality. What does that mean? When the president has his own power and Congress has his own power, the courts presume it's okay, right? The courts aren't going to second guess in this case, right? The court says, you know what? If the other two branches are okay with it, so am I, right? Not for me to judge. Okay, that's the first zone. This is your regular case where Congress enacts a statute and there's no doubts, right? The first zone is stupid, right? If Congress says, President, you can do this, of course it's okay, right? You're not even going to discuss this. So the first zone is basically irrelevant, okay? The third zone is significant. Here we call it zone 3, where Congress has not given any lawmaking powers, right? Congress has not enacted a statute saying the president can do something. Instead, the president relies only on his Article 2 powers. I said it again. In this third zone, Congress has not given the president any powers. It said, no, Mr. President, you can't do this. And the president says, well, I can do it anyway. Constitution, Article 2. This is Youngstown, by the way, right? Congress did not give the president the power to seize property. Instead, Truman relied on Article 2 of the Constitution, those three clauses, the vesting clause, the take care clause, and the commander-in-chief clause. Here, the president's power is at its lowest ebb. What the hell does lowest ebb mean? Think of like an ocean, right? During low tide, where sort of water comes all the way out, it's very shallow. Here, it's very shallow, right? The shallowest part of the water, low tide. And when the president's acting only based on his Article 2 powers, the courts will scrutinize it with caution. right? The courts will scrutinize that action with caution because they're skeptical. It's like, look, Congress told you no, you're doing it anyway. This is not probably okay, right? We'll call this later strict scrutiny, but you say here scrutinize with caution. Okay, so in the third zone, which is what we have here in Youngstown, the court's very skeptical. The president's only relying on his constitutional authority. If you are the president, you do not want to be in zone 3. You do not want to be in zone 3 because you know what? You're going to lose. If you're in zone 3, you're done. You want to be in zone 1 if you're the president. Ah, look at me, I got all this power, right? You don't want to be in zone 3. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, the third one is the sort of, I put a question mark. This is the one that drives law students batty. Yeah, I know. The third zone is what Jackson calls a zone of twilight. If you remember the old TV show, The Twilight Zone, right? What does that mean? Well, twilight is a sort of time of day where the sun's going down. It's not quite day because, you know, the sun's going down, but it's not quite night because it's still bright out, right? You know, there's that period, maybe 20 minutes, right, where it's not quite night, not quite day, you don't know what's going on. Jackson was a beautiful writer. I love his writing. He has this very memorable phrase, the twilight zone, the zone of twilight, where it's not really clear what Congress says, right? It's not really clear what the president says. The courts don't know. And when you're in this middle category, it's hard. And Jackson says, I can't tell you what goes on in that middle category. We'll deal with it when we get there, right? We'll have a case-by-case situation, which, again, law students are like, oh, come on, Jackson, you're killing me, man, right? But Jackson is very honest. He's candid. He says, we cannot decide as judges rigid, bright line rules. We need to decide these things on a case-by-case basis as we come across them. We can't do it in this sort of one step at a time. Okay? Right? Now, this is this framework, which you, again, apply if you're questioning, does the president have the power to do something? Let me tell you why this is not very helpful. Right? If you're in zone 1, it's basically automatic. Right? Congress said president can do this. Generally, those laws are fine. Zone 2, what the hell? We don't really know what that means, right? What the courts will eventually do is they'll more or less blend 1 and 2. You'll see this in a case for Thursday called Dames and Moore v. Regan. Right? Dames and Moore v. Regan. The court will eventually blend 1 and 2. So really the only one that matters is 3, where Congress says, no, you can't do this. And the president says, I can do it based on my own executive powers. This is the one that actually makes a difference, right? If the president walks into court like Truman did and says, you know what, Congress said I can't do this, but I think I can do it based on the Constitution, you're probably going to lose. Which is why this phrase executive power doesn't get you very far. Right? Lincoln tried it with the what do you call it? The suspension of habeas corpus. He tried it with emancipation, but the courts didn't review it. But in the modern era, when a president walks to court and says, I have an executive power to do X, the courts don't generally have a lot of sympathy for that argument. Instead, the president says, aha, I have this statute. And the statute doesn't answer exactly this question, but the statute gives me general authority which I can use. That's how presidents play it, right? They cite some general statute in the ballpark. So this is what gives me the authority to do it. And those are most of the executive power cases we have today aren't based on the Constitution. They're based on statutes, right? We had the Travelman case at the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. It wasn't based directly on the president's power to deny entry to people. It's based on a statute saying you can deny entry, right? All these cases you think are actually about the Constitution are actually about statutes, right? Can the president suspend deportations? It's not about presidential power. It's about statutes, right? Every executive power case you have today is basically about a statute, which is why you're almost never in zone 3. You're almost always in zone 1 or 2. Almost always. Not always, but almost always. Okay. Questions on the Jackson framework? questions on Justice Jackson? Very important decision, very important opinion. All right, Natalia, you want to walk me through the dissenters? The vote was 6-3. There were 3 dissents: Chief Justice Vinson, Justice Reed, and Justice Minton. All 3 were Truman appointees, by the way. So all 3 of the Truman, well, there was Tom Clark, who was a Truman appointee, who voted against his old boss. But Vinson, Reed, and Minton were Truman appointees who voted in favor of their appointing president. So you want to give me, please, the dissenters' argument?
Well, that these were extraordinary times.
Yeah.
That in times like these, that President Truman could faithfully execute the laws to maintain the status quo, and that other presidents had the liberty to deal with national emergencies
Okay.
as they wished.
Very good. So, Natalia, let me ask you a follow-up. Had there ever been a president who seized property before, according to the dissenters? They discuss it.
President Lincoln?
What did Lincoln seize? He did. I wasn't thinking of it. Yeah, he did. Lincoln also seized railroads and telegraphs. FDR seized property also. And they did it during times of conflict. So, David, this goes back to Frankfurter's point. We don't have this long 20-year practice of every president doing it, but we have a couple of presidents who did it. Would that be enough for the dissenters?
I believe so, yes.
Why do they think the president has this power in these times of crisis?
Just to, kind of like what she said, just to maintain everything during an emergency.
Now, this is not like a labor crisis that emerged out of nowhere. Couldn't Congress have intervened here?
Yes.
But it didn't.
No.
Does that bother the dissenters?
I believe so, yes.
Why?
Because they feel like they could have taken care of this and none would have happened. But because they didn't, now we're faced with this issue.
Yeah, so the dissenters basically say, look, this isn't so novel, right? Maybe we don't have a situation where the president seizes a steel mill, but there have been instances where the president seized private property in American history. It's happened a couple times, but big ones. President Lincoln did it, President Jefferson did it, President Roosevelt did it, right? These very important presidents did it during times of crisis. And who are we to say that these presidents were wrong? In fact, they actually cite Justice Jackson when he was the Attorney General saying that this is fine, that Roosevelt could seize property. But the court goes one step further. They say, look, we are in a time of crisis, and the court should not be engaged in this regard in the crisis times. Why? We need an energetic, vigorous executive. Go back to Hamilton in Federal 70, right? We need this sort of executive who can respond to crises. We have this serious situation where these people are going on strike and we're going to lose the war. If we don't intervene now, we'll be in trouble. So the dissent has a very different conception of executive power. Now, Nolan, what's the downside of giving the president sort of extra leeway during a time of crisis? What's like the downside of that approach?
Well, I guess one downside would be kind of this historical gloss that would be created for future presidents, and not to mention maybe a reluctancy to give up the power that.
Oh, so what's Justice Jackson? He sort of gets to this at the end of his opinion, right? Why is he really worried about giving the executive these sorts of powers during a time of emergency? What do you think is motivating him there? What do you think he was worried about?
Well, I guess this came not too long after the World Wars.
Yeah. Jackson had just spent some years of his life prosecuting Nazis in the war crimes tribunals. And you may not know this, but the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party, came to power through elections, right? And then they claimed certain emergency powers, and they never gave those powers up, right? The funny thing about emergencies is they tend not to end when people have powers, right? Oh, we have this emergency, we have to keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. And Justice Jackson says that we should not give the government these powers during emergency because they may not relinquish them, they may not give them up. And he says other branches may be okay with this. Congress may be okay with it, right? So maybe Congress is willing to relinquish its authority. But Jackson says in this great line, the courts will not, right? He says, such institutions may be destined to pass away, but it is the duty of this court to be the last, not first, to give them up. In other words, for my cold dead hand, so to speak, right? I'm not giving up this power, even if Congress is willing to. And this was again by a guy who just spent years putting Nazis in jail, right? This was his reaction to the rise of fascism and the rise of communism, that he didn't want this happening in our country. By the way, seizing a steel mill, that's like fascism 101. That's pretty. I mean that's pretty bad, even if it's for a short period of time. In other words, Congress has no emergency powers. That the powers that the government has are the same in times of peace and times of war. You can imagine that had Robert Jackson been in the same seat as Roger Taney, what would he have done in Merryman? Maybe the same thing. I don't know. Who knows? Okay. Questions on? Yes, Nick.
The dissent also talks about Congress following up with the president.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I'll ask. Oh, you're next. Perfect. So, Nick, what does the dissent make of the fact that Congress never pulled back the power and said they were just silent about this entire thing? What does the dissent make about that?
They said that it was approval.
So remember this is from contracts. You have acceptance by silence, right? If you say, do we have a contract? You just sit there and go, and then you follow through as if you had a contract. Is that a contract? Nick, how does the dissent see the sort of acceptance? Is it affirming the contract or affirming the power?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Personally?
I don't know. Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Why do you think it's ridiculous?
Because I could kind of see it when Lincoln was in office, because it was much more difficult to communicate then than the 1950s. The way technology was, it was very easy to communicate and gather a group of congressional appointees together to make a decision on a matter like this.
Yeah, I mean, is Congress ever really out of range, right, Soros?
My issue with this comes back where Justice Black talked about the TAP.
Hartley, yeah.
Congress already spoke on this.
They considered it.
And they said, we're not going to do
Well,
it.
let me ask you a follow-up question. Congress considered it and didn't vote for it. Does that mean they rejected it?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
Because they could come back to it.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to it later. Maybe we want to do something different, right? In other words, it's very common to say, oh, Congress decided not to vote on X, therefore they rejected X. That's not necessarily true. I mean, just using an easy example. Let's say you want to go see a movie, and you say, no, I'm not going to see that movie. Maybe we'll see it later. But you still like the movie, right? Can you say that because you didn't see the movie tonight, you don't want the movie anymore? So you should be hesitant to read too much into congressional inaction, and you should hesitate to read into congressional action, right? This is Nick's question. They did nothing. What do we read into it? Your question, they did something. What do we read into it, right? It's hard to get motivations from a huge body like Congress, and they either do or don't do something.
So, I mean, again, I'm assuming the reason they didn't.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you're right. I think you're right. I think you're right, by the way.
Is because they know that they didn't have the votes.
They did not have, or they didn't want the president having this power, or they wanted the president to come to Congress if the situation arises. Right? We don't know exactly why.
Exactly. They don't want the it's clear that they don't want the executive to be the sole decider of this.
Yeah. All right, let's finish up the case. Now, hang on. What happened after what happened after the court ruled in Youngstown? What was the sort of aftermath? What happened afterwards? What happened? So remember, after Taney ruled in Merryman, the guy stayed in jail, right? What happened after the court ruled in Youngstown? Did the mill? What happened to the mill? What did President Truman do? Do you have it?
I think so.
Well, what happened to the steel mill after the case decided?
I'm not sure.
Antoine?
I believe the dispute was resolved.
Yeah, and did the government, what did the government do?
They just they resolved it, so then the government backed off.
The government backed off. Truman gave in. He didn't say, haha, that's nice, steel mills stay closed, right? Stay open. Truman agreed. And there's this great story where apparently Justice Black and Truman were having a drink or something. And Truman goes to Justice Black. He says, Hugo, I don't much care for your law, but this bourbon's very good. So they had a drink about it. And Truman relinquished. At that point, the steel mill was back in the private hands. The workers went on strike. The strike lasted 50 days. Did the country fall apart? No, it didn't. So as a general matter, whenever anyone tells me we have an emergency, I don't believe them. Maybe I'm jaded, but I'm very skeptical whenever anyone says we have an emergency, we have to do this. It's generally not an emergency. Things are a way of handling themselves usually. People react and they figure things out. But Truman was irate, but he complied. Now, again, I'll ask you this question. What would have happened if Truman said, screw off, not going to do it, keeping the mills open? Can't do it. Not good.
What would have happened from the public?
Shh, you tell me. Truman says, not going to do it, screw it. That's nice. You have 6 judges, I had 3. I think those 3 are right. I agree with the dissent. That's what he says. I agree with the dissent.
I think the same thing would have happened. I think he would have eventually just let it go, I guess.
No, he fight the war. What would have happened if Truman said to the Supreme Court, I agree with the dissenters, not going to do it? Just back up, just not yet. I'm almost there. Almost there. It's 2 minutes left. Okay, well, this is not an easy question, right? Let me summarize, and I'll wrap up because we're short on time. These cases illustrate, I think, the role the Supreme Court has played in our republic. That you now have a court telling the president by a 6-3 vote, you can't seize property during a wartime, where the dissenters made, I think, very rational arguments. And the president said, you know what, I'm not going to risk infuriating the court. I'm going to go along with the court. Right? We'll do cases where maybe the president was not so willing to go along with the court. I think Lincoln would have ignored Tawney had he actually been ordered to release the prisoner. He wasn't. But here, at least, the president complied. Okay. Anyone else? All right. I'll see you all on Thursday. Thank you. I can answer your question. Yeah, well on.